Welcome back to our journey about how to set up the podcast feed using WordPress and the PowerPress plugin. In my previous video, I've explained how to get WordPress ready to accept podcasts, and we've created a single post that we're going to use as a podcast first episode. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to configure the plugin so that we can see something like this in iTunes and in Spotify, similarly in other podcast directories. So let's just go through it, what we're probably going to need at one point here. We're going to need a title for a podcast. We're going to need a podcast author. We're going to need a little description, which will be, oops, no, it's not this one, it's actually this one here. That's the little description. And we need an episode. The episode will have a date. And on top of that, we're also going to need some artwork that'll be displayed as a square icon. Artwork is supposed to be about 3000 by 3000 pixels. It kind of varies by podcast directory, but since Apple Podcast is the biggest one, we're going to go with their recommendations. You can get away with smaller icons, but it's fairly easy if you have a smaller icon to just up-res it to 3000 by 3000 pixels using an image manipulation software like Photoshop or GIMP or any other things that you have lying around basically. So in the previous episode, I've set up category podcasting on my WordPress website, and I'm going to configure that now with all these things that I've just spoken about. So in your dashboard of WordPress on the left hand side, head over to PowerPress and category podcasting. That's exactly where I'm in right now. So right now I don't have anything configured here, so let's go ahead and do that. In the drop-down menu, I can see a list of all the categories that I have created over time on my website. And in my case, I'm going to create this under podcast season 1. So podcast is one category, and that category has a subcategory, which is season 1 in my case. You don't have to do it that way. You can use literally any of these categories as a podcast feed. And if you have a website that only will ever feature a single podcast, then you can just create a single category and go with that. You don't even have to use category podcasting. But like I said earlier, if you have several smaller podcasts or a smaller series of things that you want to share with people, then it might be beneficial to share those as separate podcast feeds. Even if you have one in which you talk regularly about what's happening with your topic of choice, you may have a second one that is specifically about another topic. And like I said before, what the BBC sometimes do is they have thousands of podcast feeds, and they're not long ones either. They don't constantly add to them. They just have a single thing that is finished after 6 episodes of 30 minutes each, and then they move on to the next topic. And that's kind of the same thing I'm going to do here. So in my case, I'm going to use category podcasting, and I'm going to choose podcast season 1 as my category. And once I've picked that, I'll click this big button here, add podcast settings to category feed. And it thinks about it for a second, and now I'll go to a different menu, which now lets me set up all these things here. And we're going to go through this tab by tab. So the first one is the feed information right now. So it's given me the full URL to my feed, and that's the one I could give to the podcast directory if I wanted to, or to listeners directly who can then subscribe to it in their podcast client, and then they can listen to my episodes. There's also another option here, which is validate. And why don't we do that? I mean, we haven't really done anything to the feed yet. I wonder what happens if we just click on that and see what happens. So this is the cast feed validator. This is another service that Blubrry provide. And with it, I can validate my feed. And it'll fetch the feed and analyze it just like a podcast client would. And it says that the basic feed validation is okay, so that's not really anything that I've done there, but of course it also tells me that there's a lot of stuff missing. So I do have image information here, which is 1400 by 1400. It's not actually my logo, and I don't appear to have any feed items down here. I don't have any episodes, so that makes it very difficult for anyone to actually listen to anything. So technically it is correct and the feed is there, but there's no content in it yet. And that's of course because we haven't really added anything yet. So we're going to do that in a moment. Right now, let's just work on the other few settings here. So in feed title is the show title, and we've looked at that earlier here. The show title is literally this. thing at the top here. In this example, it was Jay's 3D podcast, and in my case, it'll be Super Survivor Season 1. That's what I'm going to call that. I may play with that a little bit, perhaps I'm going to call it something else, but for now that's fine. If you do rename that later on, then this renaming scheme is also going to appear on iTunes, so you don't have to change that. You always change that on your website. The feed description, I can either type that in here or I can use the category description, and that is something we can talk about. That you can either put that description right here, or you can use under your posts menu in categories. Let me open that in a new tab and show you where that is. This is my category. If I click into that, then I can see the description down here. So I can just add that in here, or I can add that in the Blubrry podcasts thing and then leave that category description blank. I think I might do that here. So I'm gonna say again, you can change that later, hit update, and then this description is saved by WordPress in the category. Or we can close that, and we can now leave that blank, or you can add it into here. Feed landing page URL is once again, you can leave that blank. If you do, then it will just take this as the landing page, and we can just copy this and have a quick look at what that would look like. WordPress does this, that for every category you do have an automatic landing page. Well, right now there's actually nothing in there because I haven't published that post yet. So we're going to come back to this. I'm going to leave this tab open. We're going to come back to that in a moment. It'll look very similar. It'll have the title and the category description and then a list of posts underneath it, just like I showed you that in my previous video about the 3D podcast that I've already set up. So I'm going to leave that blank as well. Podcast mirror feed we can also leave blank. Show the most recent episodes. This is another interesting one. So the RSS feed that is generated by WordPress shows something of a limited amount of posts. Imagine you had 100 posts on your website. Then technically you can ask WordPress to display 100 posts in your RSS feed as well, but often that doesn't happen by default. By default, I think it's about 10, and this plugin allows you to override that. So on my 3D podcast, I had about 26 episodes. This is going to be a lot longer than that, so I think I'm going to go with 100 episodes here. I'm just going to put that in here. I don't have to change this in the settings. There's something else. There's something similar here in the reading settings under WordPress, but PowerPress exposes that here and we don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to use 100 here. It really depends on how many episodes you intend to have on your podcast. I think currently I have about 14, no, actually closer to 20. So I need a lot more because I have a lot to say, I guess. So there we go. There is something else, the feed episode maximizer here. I would tick that. It kind of does things to settings. It is kind of recommended to do that to keep the feed at an optimal size. Copyright, I always like putting something like this in. So 2018 by Jay vs. Lewis. Caching, we don't have to worry about that. Basic show information, that's another thing that we want to do. Cleveland, Ohio, well, mine is actually based in Miami Beach, Florida. And the episode frequency, you don't have to put that in there. It doesn't really make much of a difference because the podcast directory is kind of refreshing it every so often, about every 6 hours or so, and then new episodes will be automatically pulled in. This is another interesting thing to think about. So podcasts, when you update your podcast feed by just adding a new post to your WordPress website, eventually the podcast directory will check your feed and then display the new information on that feed. So that's how that works. Donate link, this is another interesting thing. So syndicate donate link with your podcast. So I have a donation URL, which is my Patreon page. So let's put that in here. But it could just be a link to PayPal or crowdfunding website, or you can just leave that blank and untick that box. I'll put this in here, and then people can support you while listening to your podcast. in my case, if you do support me on Patreon, you get funky little goodies. You get, for example, you can get a free copy of my book in addition to the free podcast that you're going to be able to listen to. And you can also get things like free web hosting or your name in the credits, and there's all kinds of things. Check it out. It's kind of a good way of supporting me or anything that I do on the internet. If you do like what I do, then that's the place to support me. And I do thank you for it, of course, in advance. Parental rating, this is for TV settings, so mine is kind of clean, so it'll be general audience. That's what I'm going to put in here. You can already head over to the next tab and just put in all these informations that we need and then hit save changes at the end. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to keep everything that I've typed in here on the feed tab. Let's go to the next Apple tab and see what else happens. So here we go with the iTunes Program Subtitle, and once again, this is exactly what we've got here. So we've got the title and we have a subtitle. So in my case, I'm going to call that the podcast tales. And then there's the iTunes Program Summary, which is exactly the same thing that we've already set up in our category description. So this is where that goes, under the description tab. And I believe this is also being taken from the category description. I'm not entirely sure. Let's find out. I'm gonna leave that blank for now. And if that does not appear in this place like I expect, then I'm just gonna go and copy that from the posts categories where we were a minute ago. iTunes episode summary, I'm going to optimize that from my blog post content so I don't have to do this again. iTunes category, now this is something that is set per directory here, so per podcast directory. So in my case, I guess it'll be health, self-help. I think that's probably the category that my thing will fit in properly. It's kind of people and blogs really, but I think it's going to be self-help. That's going to be a good one. So let's do that. iTunes explicit. This is also required. Very important to set that. So my thing is probably not explicit. I'm going to go for clean here. So it says here, as of February 2016, you must either select yes or clean. So very important. iTunes author name is always going to be me. So I'm just going to type that in here. You can also use the blog post author in case you have different authors on a blog. Then PowerPress makes that possible to give every author the correct attribution there. iTunes email, this is required, and this is something in which the directory, in this case iTunes or Apple Podcasts, will communicate with you if and when something about your feed needs to be said or needs to be done, or if your feed is approved or not approved or whatever. They're going to communicate to you on this email. So that I'm going to make that the same as my Apple ID. You need an Apple ID to submit this thing to Apple later. So let's go and do that. Go the same email address there. iTunes type. Now this is something that I'm glad they've got that here, but sadly I'm also going to have to warn you it doesn't work. So episodic means that your latest episode is always going to be shown at the top, whereas serial means that the earliest episode is going to be shown at the top, so that people, if you have something like a serial content in which you have 5 or 6 episodes and users are meant to listen to this from episode 1 to episode 6 in sequence, then serial would be the best way to do that. And the implication would be that your earliest episodes, in my case that would say the 30th of March 2015, should be shown at the top, and then later episodes go underneath it. Sadly, it doesn't work. So no matter what you put in here, iTunes will always say it'll be episodic. So you might as well leave it on the default or don't say anything else. So I'm going to leave that on episodic. I'd love for this to be in serial. I mean, we can try serial, but in my tests on previous podcast feed, it's never worked. So it's one of those things. iTunes new feed URL. Now this is something we don't have to worry about because we're currently just setting up this feed, but should you ever do something like change your podcast category. So in my case, if I wanted to have season 1 as a standalone category without the podcast here, or if I wanted to rename this, then my feed would change. The title of my feed would physically change, and there's a way to let iTunes know about such a change. That's something that's very in-depth. We don't have to worry about that right now. Much like these two advanced options, iTunes Block and iTunes Complete. If you're podcast is ever complete, you could indicate that here, and then the directory will no longer be checking your feed. It'll assume this is going to be staying in place, and that's that. But we don't have to worry about that. So this is all that we do on the Apple tab here. The next one is the Google tab. Again, I'm not going to actually do anything about that because we can take all these informations from the Apple tab. That's very nice that they do that. The only thing that we have to set is a category, and Google has different categories to the Apple directory. So let's just set one up. In my case, I guess it'll be health. Let's just say health. Could also be comedy. That's kind of interesting as well. Let's just go health. Let's go with health. And that's really all we have to do. You could give the Google directory a different description here, or a different author, or different email here. But since that's already all set up on the Apple tab, we're going to leave everything like that in place. Next one is the artwork tab, and this is kind of the interesting one. This is now supplying an image that'll be used in the Apple directory and also in the Google directory. So this is the image in question, and all we need to do here is we need to put a URL in to that image. I was clever enough, I've already uploaded that and I've created that. So let me just open my Media Manager in a new tab. And these are all the images that are on my website at the moment. And this is the one that I've created for the podcast. And you can see the similarities here. So this is the book that I've got, and this is kind of the logo for the podcast. It also goes hand in hand with the audio version that I've created for the book. So we keep it all in the same handwriting here. And, you know, it's kind of a recognizable brand, if you want to call it that. So there we go. This is what I'm going to use, and to grab the URL to this image, this is it here. I'm just going to double tap on that and copy whatever is in here. That's the URL directly to that image. You can see the dimensions here, you can see the size here, and then we can just close that, and in fact close the whole tab down and paste that URL in here. And you can go to preview, and then that'll open that image in a new tab just to see if it's really the right one. It is rather massive, isn't it? There we go. You can close that. Once it's in here, that's the image that the iTunes and Google and all the other directories will pull in from your feed. It's the one that I've showed you before here. If we go back to this RSS feed directly, that's where that logo lives, and the RSS feed will display it with all your other information there. Should you ever change that image, you can do that here. All you need to then do is tick this box to let iTunes know they need to update their cache. In our case, we don't have to do that because we haven't submitted the feed yet. We can also use this as an episode image, and that is something that when you listen to a podcast on your podcast client, on your smartphone or in your car or whatever, then there's usually a big square that is displayed, and if you tick this box here, then this image from your upload will be used as each episode image, and I'm going to do that because that's just very nice. The Google Play image, once again, we can leave that blank because that will then use the iTunes image, and that's exactly what we want. Same thing applies here. You can upload a new image both for Google or for your RSS feed. So that's all we need to do here. Add an image, tick this box here, iTunes episode image, and that's us on the artwork tab done. We can ignore the last three tabs here: website, destinations, and other settings. Website is something if you want people to go to a certain subscribe page. You can even have the PowerPress plugin create one for you. I think it looks pretty devastating, and I'm just going to leave all that blank and not going to use any of these options, but that's just me. Please feel free to explore that on your own. Destinations tab, just to let you know what that is. On the first one here, this is your vanilla RSS feed on your website that you need to submit those to other directories. And once you've done that, these directories will give you a direct URL to their own services where you might want to redirect people to. So if you don't want people to subscribe directly on your website and you'd rather they do that through iTunes or through Spotify or through Stitcher, then you can provide those URLs. That's kind of just a convenient way. Once you have these URLs, you can add them here so that you know where they are. So there's Blubrry, and there's Stitcher, and there's TuneIn, and there's Spotify. Anything you put in here and hit save will just be saved with your settings. So in case you ever forget where that is, you don't have to go through these directories. You can just go and recall the URLs from here. This is also a convenient place for you to go straight to these services that submit your podcast feed right there. So that's kind of convenient. The only thing that's kind of an oddball out is Google, because they already give you a very weird cryptic feed and submission to these directories. We're going to cover that maybe in another video, but that's just a placeholder thing here for your URLs. Hit Save Changes once you're done, and that will now have added all these settings that we've added to your podcast feed. With all those settings in place, the one thing that we do need to do, of course, is actually add some content to our first episode so that that can be displayed alongside the RSS feed for the directories to then pull that in and let people with a podcast client actually play that episode back. And we're going to do that in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and if you like this little mini series, then please recommend it to friends, family, and total strangers. I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.